have in these outsourcing, you have an evolution towards a concentration on a number of counterparties. And not to name one, I think in cloud services, you have a very limited number of parties with whom you can work together, which creates a third-party concentration risk and also a single point of failure. And then a second element, which is important related to outsourcing, is that in some instances, we also observe a shift of power from the outsourcer, so the party who is outsourcing its service, towards the outsourcee, where the outsourcee comes into a position where he can impose conditions, contractual requirements upon the outsourcer, and where it becomes difficult in some cases for the outsourcer to include certain elements which are, for example, imposed by regulation. And one of the examples that we can immediately list there is the right to audit, which should normally be included into an outsourcing agreement. So with regard to outsourcing, I think some elements have already been integrated in the regulatory framework, but there are also some remaining blank spots which need to be tackled. And I think one of them is the third-party concentration risk. And the second one is also how you will balance or rebalance the shift of power between the outsourcer and the outsourcee.
Okay, now those are very tough topics to fix on a Belgian level, because when we're talking about concentration risk, we can straight move to big tech. So when we're talking AWS, so Amazon Web Services, but also Google Compute Engine, Microsoft, so big players offering cloud services to European banks and including Belgian ones, or software platforms such as Salesforce for CRM, which are serving several Belgian banks to put in their customer data in their platforms. And so it's interesting to see that you are following these concentrations, you're aware of it, because it is a systemic risk if something else. We also now have the geopolitical angle playing into that, all of those being American-based companies. Is this something new that is taken into account? Because a few years ago, we were less concerned about geopolitics, or is it more about independence too, and having a European tech industry, making sure that there are chances for those players who do not have a natural monopoly position?
Well, I have to say, as a supervisor, of course, we are neutral with regard to whom is delivering financial services, as long as they are licensed in Europe and they meet all the regulatory requirements. We are open for any party which comes into play. But I think the question that you refer to is much more of a political question at EU level, which is not limited to financial services, but which is the question: do we accept that certain key industries, and I think financial industry is a key industry for Europe. Do we accept that those would be in the hands of a few foreign players? And I think that's a question where probably the European Commission will also have a clear view on what the political side will say on that particular matter.
And on top of that come the element that they have all the data, and if you want to train you were referring to artificial intelligence. If you want to train your models, you need a lot of data. So those who already have a lot of data get another competitive advantage of being able to use so many data points to train their models and to optimize them.
Yes, and that brings me maybe a little bit into what has been discussed in the first panel on PSD2.
Yes, yeah.
I think PSD2 has the advantage that it opens up financial data for other parties like fintechs, big techs, and also other incumbent players. On the other hand, there are also some voices which are saying that, especially when we are looking to the relationship between PSD2 and the possibilities that big techs have to capitalize on the financial data that they obtain to PSD2, that you get somewhere of an unlevel playing field, because there is no exchange or mandatory exchange of data between the big techs and the financial actors. So to some extent, that might pose some risks, that you open up the financial sector for big techs, but you do not open up the business model of big techs for financial sector players.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm in through the parallel channel. I'm seeing that we will not be able to invite Chris Meldermans from KBC. We did prepare this session, so we had through a different platform. And I must say to you, as a regulator, that the banks are very, very strict in what they allow their employees to do on both their phones and their mobiles and their tablets, because everything seems to be blocked. So she's extremely compliant. She cannot go out of that. And we had this with several other people in this call too. So it's a little bit cynical, of course, that we're talking about digital tools, but at the same time, those people working in the industry are being blocked. And we see Chris, sorry, I cannot join. She is on her mobile phone, but on the mobile phone, we cannot invite her on stage. So that's very sorry about that part. What I will do, I will quickly go, because we prepared this and we had some points through email as well. I will look those up now so that I can bring some of Chris's points that she was going to share with us in this webinar. And then we will close with Sarah, who will also point to what has been said before. So I would maybe ask you already, Frederick, to close your points. We'll look at the questions afterwards, and I'm going to look up the email we prepared earlier. Yeah, so the floor is yours for a minute, Frederick.
Well, I would like to close by continuing what Bart has said in the previous panel. I think it's a key role for supervisors to prevent the risks that they identify from materializing and impacting the financial system in a negative way. But in order to do that, it's important that we have an open dialogue with the financial sector, with incumbents, with fintechs, with other types of new actors, to see what the magnitude or the uptake is of certain new technologies, to also see what opportunities they have to offer, but also to identify the risks that are associated with these technologies. And if I have to name the areas which are important from us as a regulator, I would say it's framework around AI machine learning. It's continuous improvement on the outsourcing framework. And it's also having a clear framework around cryptocurrencies and crypto assets. And I think that sums up relatively well what we see as priorities.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, I'm looking at my notes here, because I saw that Chris used the quote, and I'll share it in the comments, that data is the grease between the gears of the economy, and that she told us earlier on that her bank is working at great speed to implement and open in that regard, and to think really beyond open banking. It would, of course, have been great to be able to have you on stage, Chris, but I will have to limit this now to the quotes I wrote down. We discussed also the fact before that AI and machine learning are things that huge teams in banks are working on. But I remember that you stressed that these are not being used in production to make credit decisions or to make impacting decisions on the financial situation of a customer, but they are more being used to optimize the customer journeys in marketing segmentation, anti-fraud, of course. But so at this point in time, you do keep a human in the loop to make sure that when you have a credit decision to be made, that there is always a check that is balanced and that there is accountability. And this is a point that we haven't addressed much in this talk yet. The accountability of AI and machine learning is one of the big concerns that we all are confronted with. Like, we're still in the experimenting phase. We're using it in production in those fields, even within banks, in the non-crucial part of not attributing a credit decision, but in the build-up towards those decisions. What is your feeling about that, Frederick? And Chris, feel free to use the chat as you're doing now. You just made a comment that we need a level playing field for banks versus big tech. So that's definitely a request you have towards the European legislature to keep that caution point in mind when they draft new legislation, how to balance these two. But going back to the first one, accountability, Frederick, how do you see that part?
Well, accountability, and I want to come back a little bit to what I said earlier. You can have different forms of accountability. You can have really transparency on how these AI models work, the data they use, really the logics of the model. Then you can have what we call in the regulation. You can have explainability. And that's when you have some decision points or some view on how the decision that was made by an algorithm has been built up. And then finally, and I think that's probably the easiest to achieve, or the lowest requirement, you can have transparency and you can have interpretability. And that's merely where you have a general view on how the algorithm has reached a decision. And I think depending on the objective of the model, and also on whom you are presenting the model to, you should achieve different degrees of interpretability, explainability, or transparency. I would expect for us as regulators that when such models would be used, for example, in regulatory risk-weighted assets models, that we will dig very deep, and that we will want to go into something which is close to transparency, where we have a view on the data, the algorithms that have been used, the hypothesis, the features that have been used. Whereas if you are more moving towards models in which you can allow, let's call it, in which you can allow more errors, because precision is not so much important. In that area, you can go much more into just interpretability and in understanding the high-level functioning of the model. But I think, and that was my point, as long as it is not really clear what regulators will require with regard to accountability, transparency, explainability, I think it's very hard for the sector to develop this and to put this into practice. And I also would like to comment a little bit on what you said on the human in the loop. I think this is also something which needs to be discussed among the regulatory community. In which cases do you want a human in the loop, and in which cases can you accept not to have that interaction with a human? And as long as these questions are not tackled, I think every institution will make up his own practices, and it will hinder in some way the broad uptake of these models in practical production solutions.
It's interesting to notice the difference. If we look at the previous session about crypto assets, it's a general, no, you're not allowed to do this yet, and we need to work on legal frameworks. Whereas when it comes to AML, we take a different approach, which is saying we don't want to hinder the early mistakes that will happen, because we're all still learning where this can move and where it brings added value. But we leave it that way as long as it's not impacting those critical decisions. Is that a correct observation?
Yes, and I think it's because the application of these AI models is so broad. Only for us as regulators to get a view on the actual use cases where AI is used. That's a huge challenge to make up a list of all the possible use cases that we have seen in practice, be it in Belgium, in Europe, and also on an international level, because this is typically an area where there is a lot of cooperation between regulators at the international level, where we are in contact with our US colleagues, Canadian colleagues, Singapore, and Chinese colleagues to come up with something which will work for all jurisdictions and which will not be just tailor-made on the use cases that we see in the Belgian market or in the European market.
We get a comment from Tommy van de Pitte, who is saying accountability in general also includes responsibility, so between the stakeholders, and then liability. And he's given an extreme case of harm where you would make a negative credit decision and through an AI-driven risk management platform, and it would lead to the bankruptcy of the company needing that credit urgently. I'm not referring even to the Corona crisis. So yes, indeed, this is, from what I understand, a major concern. I hear it both at the incumbents and the fintechs that people are very well aware of this. This is not something that is new to any of the players using these technologies, but it's also nice to hear that we can continue to use them sensibly and with ethics and in responsible ways to make sure those decisions are explainable and that you can humanly stand behind them if you would get the same elements presented to you. We have another question in the question box this time. What initiative are regulators planning? You were referring to the outsourcer and the outsourcee in respect to accept those regulatory requirements. So how can you help the outsourcer and outsourcee as a regulator? Is this something that you already have thoughts about?
Well, in general, for banks, there is the outsourcing framework. So whenever there is an outsourcing, this needs to be notified to the regulator, and then there is a review by my banking supervision colleagues of the contract, the framework. So if we see that certain elements are not in these contracts, we can act upon that. But if I take a little bit a distance, we do understand that in some cases it's very difficult to have these conditions included in the contract. And to give an example, if we would talk about the right to audit, which should always be in an outsourcing contract. Of course, from the outsourcee point of view, if you are working with hundreds of outsourcers, which are all have a right to audit and to come into your premises and to look at how you are working, this is also something which is not practical as an outsourcee. So I believe that in term, we will need to find a solution on how we will look at outsourcees who are systemically important, who work for a lot of counterparties, to come up with a framework which can balance, I would say, their practical objections with the legal requirements. And I have seen some countries where they have said, okay, to solve this problem, we just license the outsourcees. So that might be some sort of a solution. You can also think of certification solutions to make sure that not every counterparty who is outsourcing, for example, to a cloud provider, has to do an audit on an individual level, but that you still have some sort of assurance on sorry, I get a low battery notification, that you get some kind of assurance that the outsourcee with whom you are working is respecting the legal requirements that are imposed upon.
Okay, well, you don't have to worry about the low battery warning because we are reaching the very end of this session, so that's going to be fine. I also see that we have Alexander who took the liberty to join us, which is very appreciated, to give his probably insights on that. Go ahead.
Definitely, and I appreciate that you've mentioned AI and both outsourcing, Frederick. On outsourcing, the idea is that we do not have now an EU-wide framework for supervision of these third-party providers, and we're working on it now. So today it's national supervisors that have a framework, or it's the industry-led standards that are making sure to tackle the risks about third-party outsourcing. We're putting that in place, and the idea is not to supervise the cloud, for example. It's more to find out how the financial sector is going to use all these third-party providers, and to make sure that these third-party providers are resilient enough. So that's what we're doing. We're now defining what are the risks, what activities are going to go under the scope of this framework, and how we're going to make sure this EU-wide oversight will work. So we're working on that. On AI, ML, machine learning, there's the white paper that Tom shared. Thank you very much. You do the work for me. The idea is it's a horizontal framework, and we at DigiFisma will focus on the financial sector. Now, the financial sector is actually a great example because it's one of the sectors where there is the most use of AI. And so what we will now elaborate as rules can also impact other sectors. And we're aware of explainability. We're aware that the regulation doesn't have to go too far either, because it might affect innovation, which is a topic we're now discussing. And also, how do we make sure it's accountable? Who's going to be liable in case of any mistake that comes out of these models? So we're looking in all of that. And also, it's again, we as regulators, we have one overview of the situation, but we also rely from you, all the stakeholders, to give us concrete examples of what has to be done, and in any of these cases. So this public consultation on cyber resilience is now closed, but I'm sure there's going to be much more interactions in the future once we move forward in the legislative process. Same with AI and machine learning. Please feel free to anytime send us your materials, and we're looking into that. We're more than happy to meet. And I think this is also a message to all Belgium stakeholders. You are in Brussels. You have advantage than any other digital finance stakeholders in Europe because you are there with us. And
no, we lost the advantage. We're all in webinars now, so we can be everywhere we want to. So that used to be true, but for the months coming, it won't. But anyway, much appreciated. The call for feedback that remains open to everybody. And also a word of warning to your colleagues who were watching how these sort of webinars go with stakeholders. Make sure if they have incumbents and bankers in the panels that they test up front in the platform that they are allowed on there, because Livestorm apparently is not an approved banking approved application yet. Yeah, so this is really something to take into account that we learn on the go. We really missed Chris on stage to share her insights, but I want to thank Frederick for being here to share his. And I want to move to the closing of this session by the rapporteur Sarah, who's a senior counsel payments and daily banking at Febelfin. She was also involved in all the preparations. Hi, Sarah, good to have you on stage. And so I look forward to the way that you are able to wrap up in 20-30 minutes everything we've been talking about this morning. So go ahead.
I will take up less time. I will not need 30 minutes. But first of all, I would like to thank everyone that participated to our webinar today. I believe we had more than 200 attendees, so shows that everyone adjusted to the COVID-19 reality, and that webinars can work perfectly in these conditions. I would also like to thank the different speakers from our side, from Febelfin, that made this event very interesting with divergent opinions and visions on the different topics. As mentioned by the European Commission, the objective of this webinar was to get input for several ongoing public consultations, and we welcome this initiative, of course, and are, as Belgium and as Febelfin, also happy to contribute to this initiative. Maybe not mentioned yet, but every member state will also appoint a rapporteur. For Belgium, this will be my task to report on the conclusions of the event to the European Commission in the coming months. And of course, these conclusions will be drafted in close cooperation with all relevant stakeholders, as well on the side of fintechs, as on the side of financial institutions and other stakeholders. For now, so I will be doing my best to summarize the main messages of the event, but of course, these will be further fine-tuned with the different partners in the upcoming days.
And maybe a question for you, Saar. It will also be shared by Febelfin through email and with the slides as well to everybody who was registered on this session?
We can see that we do that. In any case, the session will be distributed and will be shared with the members. And maybe when after aligning with the different parties, we can also share the conclusions. Indeed, that will be taken to the European Commission from Belgium side. Indeed.
I got several questions brought through here and directly from people asking, like, where can I get this? I'm taking notes. So that's just shows that we had some interesting points that were already shared. So let's listen to the conclusions that you have put together.
So as we have in different panels today, a digital single European market can be possible, but some prerequisites need to be fulfilled. I've heard today that a level playing field is key between banks, fintechs, and big techs. I didn't heard it today, but one of the principles that is repeated several times is same services or assets, same risk, and same rules and supervision. This should be the basis for any new regulation drafted by the European Commission, and happy to hear earlier today from Alexander that Europe is also closely looking into this, and that you are already having big techs on your radar. Toon, you wanted to?
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
I saw you pop up again. That's why I thought you wanted to add something. I think one of the key principles was also that legislation needs to be technologically neutral. It has to be horizontal and also sufficiently flexible so that consumers can be protected, but that new technologies or products that may arise in the market can also be developed and be created without being restricted to a too narrow framework, I would say. The legislator needs to provide clarity to the market regarding requirements for digital innovation, and without such clarity or even legal certainty, something that we heard a lot in the panel debate about crypto assets, innovative services are difficult to implement and roll out in the market. There was a point also raised by an incumbent today that they really need this legal certainty and this legal framework. At the beginning of the event, we also heard Fintech Belgium say that we should eliminate gold plating on national level, and that Europe should benchmark countries with the help of EU fintech hubs, which would result in more coherence between all regulators and would eliminate national discrepancies. I also noted with regard to open finance and open banking that there is still a lot of work with regard to PSD2 and opening up the access to payment accounts. I've heard issues on consent, being that people are not enough aware of what this really entails. And I also heard about unclarities or even impracticalities in the B2B space. So some open items to tackle. But on the other side, I also heard that we should not stop at open banking, open finance, but go further and look at open data. I personally believe that there is indeed in the market a growing acknowledgement that relevant data from different sectors hold significant potential for financial industry innovation, competition, and also consumer empowerment. It can help provide users with enhanced customer experience, a better risk management, a stronger security and fraud detection, better services and convenience, and the list can go on. This is also feeding into the AI and machine learning processes that we tackled during the last panel discussion. And the key driver for the use of this data should, of course, always be users' interest and empowerment. I think that's also something that was mentioned in the first panel discussion of today. I've heard from the last panel that the Commission is working on outsourcing and AI, and I've also clearly noted a call from the European Commission to share with them any concrete use cases and any information that could be interesting. Maybe to conclude, I can say that maybe the keywords of this event could be collaboration, harmonization, and clarity. It was mentioned several times by the different speakers. I think that it's key that all market players work together to harmonize the customer experience, but we need a framework for this that allows enough clarity, but also enough flexibility. One thing is clear, I think that the time to act is now. If we fail to create conditions for Belgian and also European fintechs and financial institutions to thrive, other players will take their place. So that would be all from my part. I would like to thank you all for your presence also from Febelfin side, and I hope you had an interesting morning.
So Sarah, great. Thank you for that excellent summary.
You're welcome.
If I would have been a student who didn't attend the class, I would have loved your notes on this one. So that's really a compliment for because I couldn't have summarized it any better way. So Alexander, is there anything that you heard and didn't find in the summary? Something that struck your ear or eye when we pointed it out earlier today?
Well, definitely most of all these topics we've heard from various stakeholders. What is important to us is go more in depth, have more granularity, and so, as I said before, get concrete examples. So please reply to public consultation. I'm sharing now the link in the chat, and
okay,
feel free to send emails anytime on any of these topics. We are working on this, and it's true. We need collaboration. We need the private sector and the public sector to work together to promote more innovation. We want the EU to be a strong digital finance powerhouse to be able to compete with other non-European countries. And it's important on this specific topic that we keep going the consultation and that we keep having it interactive discussion. So rest assured, on all these topics, we've taken them in account. We're actually already working on the legislation. So over the next year, and especially in Q3, we'll come up with the new strategy. It also, I've read how there's support to have more harmonization, so go beyond having regulations instead of directives, avoid gold plating and mismatches in implementations. That again, we want the best, but we're a European Union, so all member states have to abide to it and want it. So it's also up to you at your national level to share with your own authority what you want, and that's also the purpose of this event today, of putting everyone together and discussing this. So I just want to first of all thank you all for organizing this. It's been amazingly done. I can again confirm that in the participants there's many other member states that have came to see how you've organized this, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of best practices over the next events that are going to take place. I'm going to also share with you the list of the different webinars that we're going to organize. The next one is tomorrow at 10 a.m. Brussels time on tech neutrality, innovation-friendly regulatory framework. Next week is on crypto assets. Then after that, cyber resilience, and then on digital sustainable finance.
You're actually answering a question from other people in the chat who want to know where to go after this to follow up. So that's a very good resource. I'll take the liberty to also chip in, and Caroline will put the line there, the hyperlink of our Fintech Belgium weekly webinars, where we they're much shorter. It's one topic, 2-3 speakers, and we try to be as concise as everybody was on this one. And Febelfin also continues to organize a lot of trainings during this challenging time. So I think that we all as organizations have found our way into the digital way. And with that, I really want to thank everybody who has participated on stage, in the chat, or just enjoying this session. And let's, I would say, close on collaboration, harmonization, and clarity. And I would like to leave the last word to Sarah, who's been the rapporteur, to maybe find a final line on that, and thank the Commission again for reaching out. We do feel listened to, and it's a pleasure to see that these legislative initiatives now really include this sort of public rounds. I think that the clarity and the transparency of that is something that we have been looking out for a long time. So keep moving that way. Thank you very much. And Sarah, you have the final words.
I think that all has been said for now. Once again, I want to thank everyone. Also, Alexander, thank you for your interesting insights already that you gave during the webinar. And I would not say the policy, but insights at least from the European Commission on the several topics. I think I would also just say now, keep safe everyone, and hope to see you at one of our next events. And thank you all to all the partners that contributed to this event.
Thank you everybody.
Bye.
And we'll follow up, and you know where to find us. Bye bye, all the best.
Bye.
Bye.